So now let's proceed to the critique of international free trade theory of developing country experience. Traditional international trade theory is derived from a number of explicit and implicit assumptions that in many ways are often contrary to the reality of contemporary international economic relations. This is not to deny the potential benefits of a world of free trade, but rather to recognize the real world is beset by national protectionism, international non-competitive pricing policies, and other market failures. Neoclassical trade model argues that the production possibilities curve is convex, or that the opportunity cost of producing a good increases as production of goods increase. Here are the basic assumptions of the traditional neoclassical trade model must be scrutinized. First, all productive resources are fixed in quantity and constant in quality across nations and are fully employed. Second, the technology of production is fixed or similar and freely available to all nations. Moreover, the spread of such technology works to the benefits of all. Consumer tastes are also fixed and independent of the influence of producers. Third, within nations, factors of production are perfectly mobile between different production activities, and the economy as a whole is characterized by the existence of perfect competition. There are no risks or uncertainties. Fourth, the national government plays no role in international economic relations. Trade is carried out among many atomistic and anonymous producers seeking to minimize costs and maximize profits. International prices are therefore set by the forces of supply and demand. Fifth, trade is balanced for each country at any point in time, and all economies are readily able to adjust to changes in international prices within a minimum of dislocation. Six is the gains from trade that accrue to any country benefit the nationals of the country. Now let's proceed to the fixed resources, full employment, and the international immobility of capital and skilled labor. In reality, the world economy is characterized by rapid change and factors of production are fixed neither in quantity nor quality. Critics point out that this is especially true with respect to resources that are most crucial to growth and development, such as physical capital, entrepreneurial abilities, scientific capacities, the ability to carry out technological research and development, and the upgrading of technical skills in the labor force. Therefore, that the relative factor, endowment, and comparative cost are not given but are in a state of constant change. Trade and resource growth, North-South models of unequal trade. This initial assumption about the static nature of international exchange that resources are fixed, fully utilized, and internationally immobile, with product productions functions everywhere identical is central to the traditional theory of trade and finance. In recent years, some economists have therefore challenged the static neoclassical model with alternative dynamic models of trade and growth that emphasize the process of factor accumulation and uneven development along the lines. These so-called North-South trade models focus especially on the trade relations between rich and poor countries, whereas the traditional model was assumed to apply to all nations. Unemployment, resource underutilization, and the vent for surplus theory of international trade. Vent for surplus theory of international trade is the contention that opening world markets to developing countries through international trades allow those countries to make better use of formerly underutilized land and labor resources so as to produce larger primary product outputs the surpluses of which can be exported. The assumption of full employment in traditional trade models like that of the standard perfectly competitive equilibrium model of microeconomic theory violates the reality of unemployment and underemployment in developing nations. The event for surplus theory is first formulated by Adam Smith, and it was expounded in the context of developing nation by the Burmese economist Ye Min. According to this theory, the opening of world markets to remote agrarian societies creates opportunities not to reallocate fully employed resources as in the traditional models, but rather to make use of formerly underemployed land and labor resources to produce greater output to export to foreign markets. The colonial system of plantation agriculture, as well as the commercialization of small-scale subsistence agriculture, were made possible. According to this theory, the opening of world markets to remote agrarian society creates opportunities not to reallocate fully employed resources as in the traditional models, but rather to make use of formerly underemployed land and labor resources to produce greater output to export to foreign markets. The colonial system of plantation agriculture, as well as the commercialization of small-scale subsistence agriculture, were made possible. According to this view, by the availability of unemployed and underemployed human resources, in terms of production possibility analysis, the event for surplus argument can be presented by a shift in production from point B to point B. With the trade enlarging final domestic consumption from B to C, we see that before trade, the resources of this close developing world economy were underutilized. Production was occurring at point B well within the confines of the production possibility frontier, and zero X primary products and zero Y manufactures were being produced and consumed. The opening up of the nation to foreign markets provides the economic impetus to utilize these idle resources and expand primary products exportable production from 0x to 0x1 at point B on the production frontier given the international price ratio of P sub A is greater than P sub M, X to Y or equal to VB. Primary products can now be exported in exchange for Y to Y manufacturers with the result of the final consumption point C. It is attained with the same primary products, X being consumed as before, but with Y to Y more imported manufacturers now available. Unfortunately, in the short run, the beneficiary of this process were often colonial and expatriate entrepreneurs rather than developing country nationals. And in the long run, the structural orientation of developing country economies toward primary products exports in many cases created an export enclave and inhibited needed structural transformation in the direction of more diversified economy. Next is the fixed freely available technology and consumer sovereignty. Just as capital resources are rapidly growing and being dispersed to maximize the returns of their owners throughout the world, rapid technological change is profoundly affecting world trading relationships. One of the most obvious examples of impact of developed country technological change on developing country export earnings in the development of synthetic substitutes for many traditional primary products. Synthetic substitutes, commodities that are artificially produced but can be substituted for the natural commodities. Examples are the manufactured rubber, cotton, wool, and camphor. Now is the product cycle. In international trade, the progressive replacement of more developed countries by less developed countries in the production of manufactures of increasing complexity. Product cycle is management tool that evaluates the product journey from developing to withdrawal from the market. Now we proceed to internal factor mobility, perfect competition, and the uncertainty, increasing returns, imperfect competition, and issues in specialization. The traditional theory of trade assumes that nations are readily able to adjust their economic structures to the changing dictates of world prices and markets. Movement along production possibility frontiers involving the reallocation of resources from one industry to another may be easy to make on paper, but according to structuralist arguments such as reallocations are extremely difficult to achieve in practice. This is especially true in developing nations where production structures are often rigid and factor movement are largely restricted. The most obvious example of this is the plantation and small farm commercial agriculture. Now is the return to scale. It is the how much output expands when all inputs are proportionately increased. For example, if inputs is increased by 3 times but the output increases by 3.75 times, then the firm or the economy has the experience an increasing return to scale. By assuming either fixed or diminishing returns to scale, the labor costs and the factor endowment theories of trade neglect one of the most important phenomena in international economic relations. This is the pervasive and income widening effects of increasing return to scale and hence decreasing cost of production. Holistic markets control a situation in which the output of an industry is controlled by a single producer or by a group of producers who make joint decisions. Restaurants, hair salons, household items, and clothing are examples of industries with monopolistic competition. Items like soap or hamburgers are sold, marketed in price by many competing companies. Under monopolistic competition, many sellers offer differentiated products that differ slightly but serve similar purpose. By making consumers aware of products' differences, seller exerts some control over price. Now is the oligopolistic market control a situation in which small number of rival but not necessarily competing firms dominate in industry. Although only few firms dominate, it is possible that many small firms may also operate in the market. Some examples of oligopolies include the car industry, petrol retail, pharmaceutical industry, coffee shop retail, and airlines. Monopolistic and oligopolistic markets control and internationally traded economies along with widespread production differentiations, inter-industry trade, and external economies of production means that the large individual corporations are able to manipulate world prices and supplies in their own private interest. Increasing returns is a disproportionate increase in output that results from a change in scale of production. Product differentiation attempts by producers to distinguish their products from similar ones through advertising or minor design changes. From the perspective of developing nations trying to diversify their economies and promote industrial exports in particular, the phenomenon of increasing returns and product differentiation combined with non-economic power or large multinational corporation means that The first nation to industrialize are able to take advantage of these economies of scale and differentiated uh, products to perpetuate their dominant position in the world markets. The second major limitation of the perfectly competitive assumption of trade models is its exclusion of risk and uncertainty in the international trading arrangements. Risk is a situation in which the probabilities of the various possible outcomes are known, but the actual outcomes is not known. And the uncertainty is a situation in which neither the actual outcomes nor even the precise probabilities of the various possible outcomes are known. It may not be in a low-income countries long-run interest to invest heavily in primary products export promotion given the historical instability of world markets for primary commodities and comparison with those for manufactured goods. Now we proceed to the absence of national governments in trading relations. In domestic economies, the coexistence of rich and poor regions, of rapidly growing, stagnating industries, and of the persistent disproportionate regional distribution of the benefits of economic growth can all, at least in theory, be contracted and ameliorated by the intervention of the state. Growth poles regions that are more economically and socially advanced than others around them, such as urban centers versus rural areas or highway corridors in developing countries. Cumulative process for inequality within nation states by which growth poles may expand rapidly while other regions stagnate can be modified by government through legislation, taxes, transfer payments, subsidies, social service, regional development programs, and so forth. But since there is no effective international government to play a comparable role across countries, the highly uneven gains from trade can easily become self sustaining. Government has also played a strong role in cases of successful and rapid developments. Spectacular export success such as South Korea were in no small way aided and abetted by government promotion of export industries. Governments are often partisan players whose activist interventions in this area of industrial policy are specifically designated to create a comparative advantage where none existed before but where world demand is likely to rise in the future. And now let's move on to the balanced trade and international price adjustments. Balanced trade is a situation in which the value of country exports and the value of its imports are equal. The theory of international trade, like other perfectly competitive general equilibrium models in economics, is not only a full employment model but also one in which flexible domestic and international product and resources price always adjusts instantaneously to condition of supply and demand. In particular, the terms of trade adjust to equate supply and demand for a country's exportable and importable products so that trade is always balanced. That is, the value of export is always equal to the value of import. With the balanced trade and no international capital movements, balance of payments problems never arise in the pure theory of trade. Now let's move to the trade gains accruing to nationals. Enclave economy small is economically developed regions in developing countries in which the remaining areas have experienced much less progress. In some enclave economies in developing countries, such as those with substantial foreign-owned mining and plantation operations, foreigners often pay very low rents for the rights to use land, bring in their own foreign capital and skilled labor, hire local and skilled workers, and subsistence wages, and have a minimal effect on the rest of the economy, even though they may generate significant export revenues. Foreign exchange earnings is the sum of total of all foreign currency receipts less expenditure during a given fiscal year. Foreign exchange is the trading of different national currencies or unit of account, and it is important because the exchange rate, the price of one currency in terms of another, helps to determine a nation's economic health and hence the well-being of all the people residing in it. So we move on to the traditional trade strategies and policies mechanism for development, export promotion versus import substitution. A traditional way to approach the complex issues of appropriate trade policies for development is to set these specific policies in the context of broader strategy of looking outward or looking inward. In the word of Paul Stritton, outward-looking development policies encourages not only free trade but also the free movement of capital, workers, enterprises, and students, the multinational enterprise, and an open system of communication. By contrast, inward-looking development policies stress the need for nations to evolve their own styles of developing and to control their own destiny. This means setting policies to encourage indigenous learning by doing in manufacturing and developing technologies appropriate to countries' resource endowments. Now is the import substitution. Import substitution is a deliberate effort to replace consumer imports by promoting the emergence and expansion of domestic industries. Well, the export promotion is the governmental efforts to expand the volume of a country's exports through increasing export incentives, increasing this disincentives and other means in order to generate more foreign exchange and improve the current account of its balance of payment or achieve other objectives. The distinction between these two traditional trade-related development strategies is that advocates of import substitution believe that a developing economy should initially substitute domestic production of previously imported simpler consumer goods and the substitute through a domestic production for a wider range of more sophisticated manufactured items, all behind the protection of high tariffs and quotas on these imports. Primary commodity export expansion, limited demand. Commodities include crude oil, coal, copper, and agricultural products such as wheat, coffee, beans, and cotton are often traded on commodity exchanges. Many low-income countries still rely on primary products for a major of their export earnings, with the notable exception of petroleum exports and a few needed minerals. Primary products exports have grown more slowly than total world trade. International commodity is agreement is a formal agreement by seller of a common internationally traded commodity. Example is the sugar and coffee to coordinate supply and maintain price stability. Commodity agreement can also provide greater protection to individual exporting nations against excessive competition and the overexpansion of world production. And we proceed to the tariffs, infant industries, and the theory of protection. A principal mechanism of the import substitution strategy is the erection of protective tariffs or quotas behind which import substitution industries are permitted to operate. The basic economic rationale for such protection is the infant industry argument. Tariff protection against the imported commodity is needed, so the argument goes, in order to allow the now higher priced domestic producers enough time to learn the business and to achieve the economies of scale in production and external economies of learning by doing that are necessary to lower unit costs and prices. Official exchange rate is the rate at which the central bank will buy and sell the domestic currency in terms of a foreign currency such as the US dollar. While the free market exchange rate is the rate determined solely by international supply and demand for domestic currency expressed in terms of US dollar. While the overvalued exchange rate is an official exchange rate set at a level higher than its real or shadow value. To encourage local manufacturing through the importation of cheap capital and intermediate goods, official exchange rates have often been artificially overvalued. This had the effect of raising the price of exports and lowering the price of import in terms of the local currency. The net effect of overvaluing exchange rates in the context of import substitution policies is to encourage capital intensive production methods still further and to penalize the traditional primary product export sector by artificially raising the price of export in terms of foreign currencies. Let's proceed to the trade optimist and trade pessimist, summarizing the traditional debate. Trade optimist theorists who believe in the benefit of free trade, open economies, and outward looking development policies. Trade pessimist theorists who argues that without tariff protection or quantitative restriction on trade, developing countries gain little or nothing from an export-oriented open economy posture. Pessimists tend to focus on four basic themes. The first is the limited growth of world demand for primary export. Second is the secular deterioration in the term of trade for primary producing nation. Third is the rise of new protectionism against the manufactured and processed agricultural goods from developing countries, and the lastly is the presence of market failures that reduce the ability of developing countries to move up to export higher value products. New protectionism is the erection of various non-tariff trade barriers by developed countries against the manufactured exports of developing nations. The rise of new protectionism is the developed world results from the success of growing number of developing countries in producing a wide range of both primary and secondary products at competitive world market prices, combined with the quiet natural fears of workers in higher cost developed country industries that their job will be lost. Trade pessimists therefore conclude that trade opportunities are limited and even hurt developing countries for a reason. The slow growth in demand for their traditional export means that export expansion results in lower export prices and a transfer of income from poor to rich nations. Second is without import restriction, the high elasticity of developing countries' demand for import combined with a low elasticity of their exports means that developing countries must grow slowly to avoid chronic balance of payments and foreign exchange crisis. Next is developing nations have their static comparative advantage in primary products, which means that export promoting free trade policies tend to inhibit industrialization, which is in terms of major vehicle for accumulation of technical skills and entrepreneurial talents. Trade pessimists view trade liberalization under the World Trade Organization as limited in practice with developing economies, particularly the least developed countries lacking the high-powered lawyers and other resources needed to pry developed markets open. Trade liberalization is a removal of obstacles to free trade such as quotas, nominal and effective rates of protection, and exchange controls. So, trade optimists argue finally that even though export promotion may at first be difficult with limited gains, especially in comparison with the easy gain or the first stage import substitution over the longer run, the economic benefits tend to gain momentum, whereas import substitution faces rapidly diminishing returns.